Years ago, the Ottoman Empire embarked upon a widespread and systematic destruction of the Armenian people. April 24 this year marks the centennial of that crime. On that day, in 1915, in a planned and cynical manner, they rounded up all key Armenian intellectuals, hundreds of writers, composers, artists, community leaders, and exterminated them. The Armenian male population, including many in service in the Ottoman army, were massacred. The women, children, and elders were sent on death marches through the desert, where they were starved, tortured, raped, slayed. Well over half of the Armenian population was deliberately exterminated, a memory that lives on so sorrowfully in the hearts and minds of Armenians. Those who survived were ripped of everything they had: their family, property, cultural and spiritual heritage. Those who stayed were deprived of their identity as Armenians. They lived with changed names, forcefully converted in faith, whispering to each other not to be heard speaking the remains of the Armenian they were able to preserve. The Armenian nation survived and overcame. It has never asked this court to pronounce on the suffering it has witnessed, but nor did it expect this court to ever allow the deniers to find a safe haven in its pronouncements, which are already now used for propaganda purposes of falsifying the history. As an intervener, Armenia's role is to point to the correct principles under which this case should be decided, and to indicate errors that have infected the lower court judgment. Whether or not its conclusion was correct does not matter, as much as certain misstatements of fact which have comforted genocide deniers throughout the world. We are here to ensure that such errors should never be repeated by a court that speaks in the name of human rights. Mr. President, I would like to introduce Mr. Jeffrey Robertson, QC, and then Mrs. Amal Clooney, who will present further submission on behalf of Armenia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kostanyan. I give the floor to Mr. Robertson.
Mr. President, honourable judges, the object of the Ottoman Empire in 1915, as the German ambassador Wolf Metternich explained in a cable to Berlin, was, I quote, the elimination of the Armenian question through the extermination of the Armenian race, unquote. It was by a study of what happened to the Armenians, followed by what was happening to the Jews in Germany, that led Raphael Lemkin to coin the term genocide to describe the worst of all crimes against humanity, a crime that all states now have a duty to combat. The issue in this case is whether the Swiss law under which this man Perinçek was convicted, Article 261 bis of the Penal Code, conforms to the freedom of expression guarantee in Article 10 of the European Convention. Article 10 is the Convention's way of saying, "Je suis Charlie," in the true Voltairean sense of permitting people to publish information and criticism and satire, however offensive, so long as it doesn't cause harm. It sets up a presumption, does Article 10, in favour of free speech in a convention that protects other rights to dignity, such as the right to live free of race hatred or discrimination, the right to say, "I am Jewish, I am Muslim, or I am Armenian," without fear that the race we happen to be born into will be stigmatized as inferior or subhuman. That is why Article 10 has its proviso which permits speech to be restrained by law on those occasions when it is likely to and intended to cause harm, to incite racial violence or hatred. Now, in the mouth of a rabid racist with a doctorate in law and a political party at his back and people waving flags and fists outside this court now, genocide denial can have a double impact. It makes survivors of genocide and their children and grandchildren feel the worthlessness and contempt and inferiority that the initial perpetrators intended. And it incites admiration for those perpetrators and a dangerous desire to emulate them. In this case, the Swiss courts decided that Perinçek's intentions were racist. They decided it. That his words in the Turkish language were designed to arouse his supporters in Turkey to hate Armenians and to applaud his hero, Talat Pasha, the Ottoman Hitler. Now, we acknowledge that some reasonable people will think the Swiss courts struck the wrong balance and that the antics of a character like Perinçek are laughable rather than dangerous. Perhaps that doesn't mean the law itself contravenes the convention or that its application in this case should be decided in his favour. That would only follow if the Swiss courts were outside the margin of appreciation that is permitted to states in regard to laws that have the legitimate aim of combating racial discrimination, the actual crime of which he was convicted. Well, what's the test for determining margin of appreciation? It depends on whether the statement has any public interest. Perinçek's provocative expostulation had no value or interest at all. It had no weight coming from a man who said evidence would never change his mind. It had no argument. It was ideologically vapid. It was made by a man who only came to Switzerland in order to be convicted. That was its purpose, so he could be convicted. He went to Germany and France. They didn't bite. They didn't prosecute him. The other day he tried to go to Greece to expostulate his genocide denial. They took the less expensive and quicker course of simply denying him entry. He's a genocide denier forum shopper. He seeks out countries in Europe where he can be convicted and so by so doing promote himself and his perverse view of history. In England, we'd call him a vexatious litigant, a pest. So it was absurd for the court below to suggest that his statement had any political, historical, or legal value simply because it was made at a conference. That makes no difference, or because it was part of a heated debate. There was no debate at all on the three occasions it was made. It was made merely for the purpose of defying Swiss law. Calling him a politician, which the lower case court did, gives him perhaps an uncalled for gravitas in his utterances. He's an incorrigible genocide denier, a criminal and a vexatious litigant. The Swiss courts concluded, looking at the evidence, that his statement was made with racist intent. So in evaluating the social danger in Turkey, for Armenians in Turkey, where his statement was directed, as well as in Switzerland, the court should have a wide margin of appreciation. Armenia's compelling interest today, as you've seen in its submissions, is to refute certain suggestions in the judgment that there was any doubt over whether the 1915 massacres and deportations amounted to genocide. We're all agreed today that that's not the issue. The court, in the first paragraph of its judgment on the law, said we're not called upon to decide that, and yet it went on in paragraphs 115 to 117 to actually cast doubt over the genocide and to comfort genocide deniers. A human rights court comforting genocide deniers by errors. Paragraph 115 says there can't be consensus about genocide because only 20 of 190 states in the world have recognized it. But that's obviously a bad point because the vast majority of those states have never been asked, have never considered the matter. And no state in the world except Turkey has decided that it was not a genocide. There's no divergence, as the French suggest. Name another state that has decided formally, other than Turkey, that it wasn't genocide. Those that have decided that it was genocide, after serious historical and legal inquiry, include almost all the major European states, not to mention 43 out of 50 states of the United States, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The court was seriously misinformed by the Turkish government about the UK position. The UK abandoned its suggestion that the evidence wasn't sufficiently unequivocal some years ago. We can show you on the Foreign Office website that it has currently taken into account decisions on genocide by international courts and abandoned that suggestion. We do say that paragraph 117 of the judgment seems to suggest, and I quote, that the 1915 events can never be subject to final conclusions or objective or absolute truths. If this is what that paragraph really means, that's pernicious nonsense and a grievous insult to every Armenian whose relations were starved and massacred for their ethnicity and their religion. How can a court committed to belief in human rights and therefore to a belief that those guilty of atrocities can be convicted on evidence that proves guilt beyond reasonable doubt, believe that massacres and death marches are, quote, by definition controversial and debatable? That is for courts to decide. The paragraph goes on to make an invidious and erroneous distinction between denying the Armenian genocide and denying the Holocaust. It says, in the latter case, there's concrete evidence of, quote, the existence of gas chambers, unquote. But here there is the most concrete evidence of death marches and massacres, of laws to expropriate property because they knew the Armenians were not coming back. Amal Clooney will detail that decision, the evidence of destroying most of the Armenian race. The lower court then claimed that an international military tribunal at Nuremberg had convicted the Nazis and no such tribunal had convicted the Young Turks. Well, of course, it had. The military tribunal in Turkey, applying international military law in 1919, convicted Talat and his gang. But here, what is worrying is that the lower court is apparently saying that you can't call an atrocity genocide unless there's been an international court conviction for genocide. That's absurd. The Holocaust itself wouldn't qualify as genocide under this standard because the judgment in Nuremberg at 1946 made no mention of genocide, which didn't come into existence as a crime until the convention in 1948. Well, these are egregious errors of Chamber 2, which we urge the Ground Chamber not to correct. In fact, they promote the idea that the Holocaust is the only real genocide, with others forever relegated to the realms of history and debate, theory and debate. Of course, the Holocaust was an appalling example of the worst of crimes against humanity. But it is wrong to excuse or to minimize other mass murders on the grounds of race and religion because they have fewer victims or different methods of killing. What matters to Armenians, to Jews, to Bosnians and Bengalis, to Rwandan Tutsis, and today to Yazidis, is not the manner of their death, or whether an international court has convicted the perpetrators, but the fact that they were targeted as unfit to live because they were Jews or Armenians or Yazidis. By seeking somehow the lower court to privilege the Holocaust as the only proven genocide, the reasoning in this judgment damages the vital human rights cause of genocide prevention. Whatever this chamber decides on Article 10, the perverse notion that there is any doubt about the truth of the Armenian genocide should not feature in its reasoning. It was not, as genocide deniers pretend, a tragedy. It was a crime, an international crime of genocide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Mrs. Clooney.